I sat in my recliner, staring at the coffee table in front of me. 3 champagne flutes sat there, 1 full, 2 empty. Next to them, a bottle of champagne chilled in an ice bucket, its condensation dripping onto the polished wood. A fitting metaphor, really. The slow unraveling of something once whole. At precisely 7:02 p.m., I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I simply waited. A few seconds later, the front door creaked open. "Dave? Where are you?" My wife's voice rang through the house, that familiar tone I had once found comforting. Now it was just noise. In the formal lounge, "Deb," I answered, my voice steady. "Cold." She stepped into the room, gripping the hand of a man about 5 years younger than her. Slim, well-dressed, a lawyer by the looks of him. In her other hand, she clutched a large, orange envelope. "Dave, this is Michael." "Michael, my husband, Dave." Her voice was tight, nervous. I stood, took 3 steps forward, and shook the man's hand warmly. I watched him closely. He was expecting hostility, maybe even violence. Instead, I smiled. "I'm very pleased to meet you, Michael. Do you mind if I call you Mike?" He blinked in surprise. "Not at all, sir." "Oh, please, Dave is fine. Can I offer you both a glass of champagne?" I gestured toward the coffee table. "Please, take a seat." The confusion in their eyes was delicious. I poured the drinks, raising my glass. "Cheers. Now, do you mind telling this simple man what's going on?" Deborah hesitated. She squeezed Mike's hand, silently asking for support. Finally, she exhaled. "Dave, there's no easy way to say this, so I'll just say it. Michael and I are in love. I want a divorce so we can get married." She braced herself, waiting for the explosion. For anger. For begging. For something. Anything. Instead, I took a sip of my drink and nodded. "Okay, Deb. Are those the divorce papers?" Deborah's mouth parted slightly, stunned. She wasn't prepared for this. I looked at Michael instead. He was the calmer of the two. He nodded and placed the envelope on the table. "Yes, Dave. These are the papers. Deborah is asking for nothing but her car. Everything else, the house, the assets, your retirement fund, she's leaving to you. It's all been notarized. I assure you, everything is legally sound." "How generous of you," I mused, swirling the champagne in my glass. "That was Mike's idea," Deborah cut in. "He insisted. He said it was bad enough he was." She stopped herself. "Stealing your wife?" I offered with a smirk. She flinched. I leaned back in my chair. "And tell me, Mike, is your wife going to receive a similar speech to this one? Or has she already?" Mike straightened his tie. "My wife passed away 8 years ago. I'm a widower." I tilted my head. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mike. Truly." "Thank you," he said, relaxing slightly. It was difficult, but meeting Deborah, she completed something in me I thought I had lost. How poetic, I mused. Deborah was shifting uncomfortably. This wasn't how she had imagined this conversation going. No fireworks, no pleading, no accusations. Just calm. "You met Mike at one of your girls' nights out, I presume?" I asked, turning to her. She nodded, avoiding my gaze. "One of those nights you swore were harmless? That there was nothing for me to worry about?" Another nod. This time, she stared at the floor. I sighed, taking another sip. "Well, I suppose there's a lesson in that, Mikey boy." Mike frowned slightly, looking at Deb. She refused to meet his eyes. "So what happens now?" I asked casually. Mike sat forward. "Dave, I know this isn't easy for you, and I want to assure you that we're not here to hurt you." I laughed, deep, genuine laughter. "Mike, that ship has long since sailed." Deborah's hand trembled slightly as she took another sip of her drink. "I'll sign the papers," I continued. "I'll make this as painless as possible." Deborah's head snapped up. "You will?" "Of course," I said. "You two are in love. Who am I to stand in the way?" Relief washed over her face. "Oh, Dave, But," I cut her off. "There are conditions." The relief faded. Mike cleared his throat. "What kind of conditions?" I smirked, standing up and picking up the envelope. "Oh, nothing unreasonable. Just a few loose ends I need to tie up first." Deborah's grip on her glass tightened. "Dave, please, don't make this difficult." "Who, me?" I placed a hand on my chest, feigning offense. "Difficult? Never." I turned toward the fireplace, running my fingers over the mantel where our wedding photo once sat. A reminder of the woman who had just admitted to 20 years of lies. "No, I wouldn't make this difficult. I would make it impossible." I turned the envelope over in my hands, feeling the weight of it. Not just the physical weight, but what it represented. 2 decades of betrayal. A marriage that had been nothing more than a long, elaborate lie. Mike, I said, tossing the envelope back onto the table. I appreciate the courtesy of you making sure everything is fair in this arrangement. Truly. But there's something I need to ask Deborah before I sign anything. Deb stiffened, her fingers curling around her champagne flute. What is it, Dave? I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and met her gaze with an expression so neutral it made her squirm. How long? Her lips parted, but no sound came out. You know what I'm asking. My voice was calm, but my heart was hammering in my chest. How long have you been cheating on me, Deb? Mike shifted uncomfortably. He probably thought this was just some dramatic moment before I signed the papers and let them waltz off into their perfect future. The poor idiot. Deb swallowed hard, glancing at Mike, then back at me. It started about a year ago. I stared at her. Then I smiled. A slow, knowing smile. That's a lie, I said softly. Her breath hitched. Mike frowned. Dave, I understand this is difficult, but there's no need. Shut up, Mike, I interrupted without even looking at him. He bristled, but I wasn't interested in his feelings. I had waited too long for this moment, and I wasn't about to let some smooth-talking lawyer control the narrative. Deborah, I'll ask again, I said, tilting my head. How long? She hesitated. Dave, 20 years. Dead silence. Mike looked at Deb, confused. That's not true, is it? Deb's face drained of all color. I found out a while ago, I continued, my voice eerily steady. Not just about you and Mike. About the others. The ones before him. Deb's hand shot to her mouth, eyes wide with panic. Mike sat back, stunned. Deb. What is he talking about? She shook her head rapidly, but I wasn't finished. You think I didn't notice? I laughed, shaking my head. The late-night meetings, the girls' trips, the sudden new perfumes, the gym memberships you barely used. The way you started sleeping on the edge of the bed as if I had turned into a stranger overnight. I leaned in. I knew, Deb. I've known for years. Mike pushed back from the couch, his hands gripping his knees as if the truth had physically struck him. Tell me he's lying, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Deborah shook her head wildly, but it was too late. The crack in her carefully constructed world was growing into a fracture. You're lying, she finally spat out. Am I? I reached into the drawer of the side table and pulled out a small, black USB drive. What if I told you I have proof? Would you still call me a liar? She stared at the tiny object in my hand as if it were a loaded gun. Dave, please. You don't get to please me, Deb. I exhaled sharply. Do you have any idea how long I've had to pretend? How long I had to listen to you tell me I was paranoid whenever I asked if something was wrong? How long I had to sit across from you at dinner and wonder if you had just come back from some other man's bed? A tear slipped down her cheek. But I felt nothing. Mike, now pale as a ghost, ran a hand through his hair. This isn't what you told me, Deb. I turned to him. And what exactly did she tell you, Mike? He swallowed hard. She said your marriage was practically over when we met. That you'd grown distant, that you didn't love her anymore. I chuckled darkly. Did she now? I glanced at Deb. That's rich. Mike turned back to Deb, his jaw tightening. You said you were unhappy for years, but you never mentioned this. Was any of it even true? She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The silence between them was deafening. I stood up, stretching slightly, as if I had just finished a long day of work. Well, this has been fun, but I think we're done here. I grabbed the envelope from the table and tossed it back at Mike. I'll have my lawyer review these. Expect a call in a few days. Mike stood abruptly. Wait. I ignored him. Instead, I turned to Deb, who was still sitting there, shell-shocked. You wanted a divorce? I said. Fine. You'll get it. Then I leaned in close and whispered just loud enough for her to hear. But I'm going to make sure you regret every second of it. She gasped, her body trembling. I straightened, adjusted my tie, and strode out of the room without another word. The first cut had been made. Now, it was time to carve deeper. I didn't slam the door when I left the lounge. I didn't storm out like the heartbroken, betrayed husband Deborah probably expected. No, I walked. Slowly. Deliberately. Because this wasn't about emotions. Not anymore. Deb had spent 20 years lying to me, building a life on deception while expecting me to be too blind or too loyal to see the truth. And she thought she could walk away from it all clean, with her reputation intact, with my dignity left in shambles. No. I was going to burn everything down. I drove to a small law firm downtown, not the high-end, expensive kind, but the kind that specialized in getting messy, brutal results. I had already spoken with a lawyer weeks ago when I started gathering evidence. A divorce was inevitable, and I intended to be the one holding the knife. Mr. Brown, my lawyer, Simon, greeted me as I entered his office. He was a sharp-eyed man in his late 50s, dressed in a simple suit that screamed experience rather than flash. Do we have the green light? I sat down across from him and slid the divorce papers across the desk. She thinks she's doing me a favor, I said, smirking. Giving me everything, walking away with just her car. Mike convinced her it was the right thing to do. Simon picked up the papers, flipping through them with a neutral expression. If only all cases were this easy, he murmured. I leaned forward. I don't want easy. His eyes flicked up to meet mine. I want destruction, I said. Simon exhaled slowly, setting the papers down. Tell me what you have in mind. 2 days later, Deborah called me. Dave, can we talk? Her voice was tight, like she had been crying. Of course, I said, keeping my tone light. Should I come to you, or would you prefer to meet somewhere? She hesitated. I'd rather come to the house. Of course she would. It was still her comfort zone, even if she had signed it away without a second thought. See you soon, I said and hung up. I knew what this was. She wasn't second-guessing the divorce. No, she was second-guessing me. The way I had handled it. The way I hadn't fought or begged. She had expected a wounded animal. Instead, she got a man sharpening his knives. An hour later, she arrived. She looked pale, exhausted. Even beautiful in that tragic way. Something wrong? I asked as I let her in. She walked past me without answering, hugging her arms around herself. I just need to understand something, Dave. I nodded, playing the patient, kind husband one last time. Go on. She turned to me, her face crumbling. Why aren't you angry? I tilted my head. You expected me to scream? Break things? Call you names? Her silence was my answer. You had an affair for 20 years, I said evenly. More than one, actually. I took a slow step toward her, watching her flinch. You lied to my face. You made me feel like a fool. And now that I'm letting you go without a fight, suddenly you don't like it. Her lip trembled. I just thought. You thought I'd fall apart, I finished for her. That I'd beg you to stay, that I'd fight Mike, that I'd throw a tantrum. I shook my head. You still don't get it, do you, Deb? Her eyes searched mine, desperate. I'm not letting you go, Deborah. I smiled coldly. I'm setting you free. And trust me, you're not going to like it. I saw the panic rise in her eyes, but before she could speak, I delivered the second betrayal, the one she never saw coming. I already filed my own petition, I said, walking past her to the table where my new set of legal documents sat. And unlike your little goodwill gesture, I'm contesting the divorce. She gasped. What? But I gave you everything. Why would you contest it? I turned, staring into her eyes. Because I want more. She shook her head in disbelief. Mike said. Mike is an idiot, I interrupted. And you're a fool if you think this will be painless. I picked up the papers and placed them in her shaking hands. I'm contesting spousal support. You will pay me. She let out a small, strangled noise, her fingers gripping the edges of the documents. Dave, you know I don't make as much as you do. You didn't work for over a decade, Deb. While I paid every bill, every mortgage payment, every vacation. Courts look at that, I said coolly. Which means, under community property law, I can request alimony from you. Her eyes widened. You wouldn't. I leaned in. Watch me. Her breathing turned ragged. And that's not all, I added, savoring the moment. I've sent copies of my evidence to Mike's firm's ethics committee. Did you know he's supposed to report personal relationships with clients that could lead to a conflict of interest? Whoops. She turned white. Dave. By the way, you may want to warn Mike. I mused. He's about to have a very difficult week. I saw it then, the moment she realized the full weight of her mistake. She thought she had been in control. She thought she could cheat, betray, and walk away clean. Now, she understood the truth. This wasn't a divorce. This was war. And I was just getting started. Deborah stood there, gripping the divorce papers as if they were the only thing keeping her upright. Her breath was shallow, her pupils blown wide with panic. For the first time, I saw it, true, unfiltered fear. Good. You're destroying my life, she whispered. I leaned in, just enough for her to hear the venom in my voice. You destroyed mine first. She opened her mouth, maybe to protest, maybe to beg. But before she could, her phone rang. She jumped at the sound, fumbling to pull it from her purse. When she saw the caller ID, her face twisted in dread. "Answer it," I murmured. "I'll wait." Hands trembling, she pressed the phone to her ear. "Mike?" Even standing across from her, I could hear him yelling. "Deborah, what the hell did you do?" She flinched as if he had slapped her. "Mike, they put me on immediate leave," he roared. "The partners called me in this morning. They have emails, phone logs, pictures, for God's sake. They said I violated the firm's ethics policy." I tilted my head, feigning concern. "Oh dear, that must be inconvenient." Deborah looked at me, eyes filling with silent fury. "You did this," she mouthed. I smiled. "Mike, I swear, I didn't, eh? And what's this about your husband contesting the divorce?" Mike seethed. "You told me everything was handled." I don't know." She shot me a desperate glance, but I simply gestured for her to continue. "Fix this, Deborah," Mike snapped. "Do you have any idea how this makes me look? My reputation is—" I stepped forward, close enough that she could feel the heat of my breath. "Tell him," I said softly. She shook her head. I raised an eyebrow. Her lips parted. She let out a breath. Then, in the smallest voice, she said, "I can't." Mike went silent. "Then, what?" Deborah swallowed hard. "Dave has evidence. Years of it." The silence stretched long and heavy. Then, the cold finality of Mike's words sealed it. "We're done." Deborah gasped. "Mike, wait." But he had already hung up. She stood there, motionless, her phone still pressed to her ear as if willing the call to come back. I let the silence settle, let the weight of her new reality suffocate her just a little longer. Then, I picked up my glass of water and took a slow sip. "Well," I said finally, "that was unfortunate." She looked at me like she wanted to kill me. I tilted my head, watching the full, awful realization dawn in her expression. She had lost everything in a single stroke. Her lover, her marriage, her future. And I was far from finished. That night, I sat on the deck of my house, nursing a glass of bourbon and watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. I thought revenge would feel different, like fire, like satisfaction. But it didn't. It felt like nothing. Like silence after a storm. 20 years. I had spent 20 years of my life devoted to a woman who had betrayed me without hesitation. A woman who had looked me in the eyes every morning and pretended to love me while sneaking around with other men. And yet, it wasn't anger I felt. It was emptiness. The kind of emptiness that comes when you realize everything you built was a lie. But maybe that was okay. Because now, I was free. Deborah thought she was leaving me behind. But in truth, I had already left her. And this was just my way of making sure she understood what that meant. As I swirled the bourbon in my glass, I glanced at my phone. I had one final move to make. I smirked. Let's see how she handles this. The next morning, I set my plan in motion. Deborah had already lost her lover, but that wasn't enough. She had spent 20 years building a life off of lies. Now, I was going to make sure there was nowhere left for her to hide. I made a few calls. Some to people she considered friends, some to family. I wasn't dramatic, nor did I rant or rage. No, I simply shared the truth. "Did you know Deborah has been having affairs for 20 years? I asked her sister, Claire. A sharp intake of breath. "What? Did you know she had multiple affairs before Mike?" Silence. "I have the proof," I continued. "Would you like to see it?" She whispered, "Oh my God." I made sure to time my calls well, so that by the time Deborah left whatever hotel or couch she had been sobbing on, the whispers had already started. Her mother, furious. Her best friend, disgusted. Her coworkers, gossiping behind her back. By noon, she called me. I let it ring. By the fourth call, I picked up. "What have you done?" she sobbed. I took another sip of my drink and stared out at the horizon. "I told the truth, Deb. That's all. You're ruining me." I let out a soft laugh. "No, sweetheart. You ruined yourself. And then, just for the final cut, enjoy your new life." "Oh, wait. You don't have one anymore." I hung up. Deborah Brown was officially finished. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Deb tried to fight me in court, but her lawyers knew it was pointless. She had nothing left. No job, she had quietly resigned when the office gossip got too loud. No social standing, her friends had turned their backs on her. She tried to negotiate. "Dave, please," she begged when we met for mediation. "Let's just end this peacefully." I folded my arms, amused. "Now you want peace?" She flinched. She was exhausted, her eyes sunken, her once well-maintained hair now dull and unkempt. The woman who had once carried herself with confidence now looked like a ghost of herself. I leaned forward, my voice softer but unyielding. You had 20 years to be honest, Deb. 20 years to do the right thing. And now you want mercy? Tears welled in her eyes. I stood up. No. And with that, I left the room. By the end of the week, the divorce was finalized. She lost the house. She lost her savings. She even lost her car when I proved she had used my money to buy it. In the end, she walked away with nothing. Well, nothing except the shame of being known as the woman who had thrown away her marriage for fleeting affairs. A month later, I was sitting at my favorite bar when a familiar voice interrupted my peace. Mind if I join you? I looked up. Mike. I smirked. Surprised you survived the fallout. He sat down, running a hand through his hair. He looked worse than the last time I saw him, tired, thinner, broken. I lost everything, he muttered. I shrugged. So did she. He let out a humorless laugh. Yeah, well, turns out, my firm didn't just suspend me. They blacklisted me. No one will touch me now. I raised an eyebrow. And why is that my problem? He met my eyes. It's not. I wanted to say something. I waited. I was an idiot, he admitted. I believed everything she said. She told me you were the problem, that she was trapped, that you didn't love her. He exhaled. I thought I was saving her. I shook my head. You were just the latest in a long line of fools. Mike flinched. But he didn't deny it. After a long pause, he muttered, I should have known better. I took a sip of my drink and leaned back. Yeah, Mike. You should have. And then, without another word, I left him sitting there, drowning in his regrets. Months passed. The house no longer felt haunted by memories of betrayal. The walls were mine again. I focused on rebuilding, not just my home, but myself. I traveled. I reconnected with old friends. I even started dating again, not seriously, but enough to remember what it felt like to be wanted by someone who wasn't hiding secrets behind their smile. And for the first time in years, I felt free. It happened on a rainy Tuesday. I was walking through the park, enjoying the crisp air, when I saw her. Deborah. She was sitting on a bench, staring at nothing, her once pristine coat now worn and slightly tattered. For a second, I considered walking past. But then, on some cruel impulse, I stopped. She looked up, startled. Then, her expression crumbled. Dave, she whispered. I nodded. Deborah. Silence stretched between us. Finally, she swallowed hard. I lost everything. I tilted my head. Did you? Her eyes filled with tears. I loved you once, you know. I chuckled. No, Deb. You loved having me. There's a difference. She wiped her eyes. I miss you. I studied her. And for the first time since this all began, I felt nothing. No anger. No hatred. No satisfaction. Just nothing. I nodded once, then turned to leave. She didn't call after me. She just sat there, lost in the ruins of the life she had destroyed. And I kept walking. They say time heals all wounds. I don't know if that's true. But I do know this. Revenge didn't fix me. It didn't undo the past. But it did give me justice. And justice was enough. 1 year later, I stood on the balcony of my new home, a fresh drink in my hand, a beautiful woman laughing beside me. And for the first time in a long, long time, I smiled. Not because of revenge. Not because of Deborah's downfall. But because I had finally let it all go. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all.